Hello. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. My name is Nicole Imgrund, and I'm the owner and director of Rivers Edge Counseling Center. And tonight we have a special presentation, a webinar for you called Thriving versus Surviving, Understanding Coping versus Self-Care with our facilitator, Brittany Imperadero. So before we get started, I'm going to just make a few announcements. I hope that's okay. The first is about a big event that we are hosting in 5 weeks now on October 26th. Tarek Haddad is the founder and owner of Peace by Chocolate. He is a Syrian refugee who came to Canada just, I think, about five or 6 years ago now, and he has become one of the most dynamic, interesting speakers in Canada today. He talks about his family's journey from Syria and their building up of their business in Nova Scotia, Peace by Chocolate. He is Canada's Immigrant of the Year this last year. He's won lots of awards for entrepreneurship. When President Biden came to Canada a few months ago, Canada's gift to him was one of the chocolate bars. They are really delicious if you haven't had them. And so he is going to speak with us about resilience. Also at that event, I'm equally excited for some Indigenous classical musicians who will be joining us. Jessica McMahon is an award-winning musician from right here in Alberta, and she's created a trio that is going to be playing for us. The musicians that are coming have played for the London Philharmonic Orchestra at Carnegie Hall. They're incredible. And so it will be a night to remember, and it is also in support of our food bank here in St. Albert. So if you're able to join us, we'd love to have you. We have the cost of it is about $45, but we have a coupon code called Rivers Edge for our friends of Rivers Edge right now until October 5th. So go to our website and check it out, and we would love to have you. This talk tonight is part of a series, our Wellness Matters webinars. We also do these talks in person sometimes as well. We've done over 120 of these talks, and there are about 65 of them recorded on our website. So if you go to the blog page, you'll see lots of past webinars too. You can watch anytime. And one last announcement is about the programs. We have a brand new, beautiful group program space. And so we've launched some programs to offer some mental health services that are accessible and really effective in a different way for clients as well. And we've picked topics that we've heard from clients and other organizations in St. Albert were really in need. So you can see we have such a diversity of programs coming up. Yeah, and there's one just in a couple of weeks here talking about teen girls with puberty, getting that process started, that difficult conversation. I kind of flipped past one here that actually Brittany is going to be doing. It's a series of 2 sessions, getting through the tough stuff, supporting kids and teens through self-harm, suicidal thoughts, and other disclosures. So that will be a wonderful resource for families. And then, of course, there's a teen wellness group that we have run for many years as well. So we have lots of things going on. We'd be happy to see you at any of them, but I'm just so happy you're here tonight. And so let me just share a little bit more about Brittany before we get started. Brittany is a registered provisional psychologist, and we are so fortunate to have her working with us at Rivers Edge Counseling. Brittany works with children, teens, and adults, and she comes from a client-centered and trauma-informed lens. Brittany's practice has been largely shaped by the spaces she has worked in, including at early learning development centers, in schools as a behavior therapist, with inner city youth in group homes, or at centers like iHuman and at the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton. When Brittany isn't busy running workshops or working with clients, you can find her reading a good book, watching a scary movie. One of our students was telling me this week they love scary movies so much they're doing a scary movie challenge. They're watching one a day. I couldn't watch one at all.
I love that.
I would never sleep, but we need to get you and she talking with each other. But also, which I can get more on board with, you enjoy cuddling your dogs, which they're adorable. I've seen
Yeah.
pictures, and traveling.
Yeah.
So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Brittany. I'm going to be here watching the chat in case there's any technical stuff I can help with. But otherwise, we'll catch up again at the end. Brittany said her talk isn't going to fill the full hour, so we'll have time for some questions and comments. So put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, and we'll read them together at the end. And yeah, I'll see you then. Over to you, Brittany.
All right, thank you. I'll just go ahead then and share my screen here. Well, welcome everyone to our talk here today. So like Nicole mentioned, today we are going to be talking about self-care and coping. So in terms of the presentation, and I'm just going to move something out of my way. I know you won't be able to see it, but anyway. So in terms of the presentation, the nice thing about this is it's more like a workshop style. So pretty informal, not too much like participation needed. However, participation is always voluntary. There will be time, like Nicole mentioned, for questions at the end. But of course, as we go along, if there's questions you have, like Nicole mentioned, please pop them in the chat so that you're not trying to hold on to them for the entire session. Or else we do have a Q&A on the lower bottom bar that you'll be able to see. Additionally, something that may be helpful for participants is if you do have something to write with, if you're someone who likes to write things down as we go through information. And then of course, making yourself comfortable. So making sure you have any snacks, drinks, or items, keeping your phone on silent if you need to, but of course, if you need to step away, know that you always can. With that being said, I guess, we'll get started here. So in terms of our presentation, let's go through our agenda. So on the agenda today, we're going to be talking about our logical versus survival brain, just to kind of get an idea of how this impacts coping and self-care. We're of course going to talk about what self-care is, what coping is. We're going to take a look at a concept known as window of tolerance. Some of you may be familiar with it, but if not, this is a great opportunity to kind of learn a little bit about this topic. And then, of course, we're going to talk about how self-care and coping really make up the idea of what thriving versus surviving is. And then at the end, like we mentioned, there will be some time for questions. So to start off, we're going to talk about the brain. So there's so many different ways to learn about the brain. There's so much great information about the brain. But for the purpose of a 1-hour conversation, we're going to keep it as simple as possible. So one of the reasons I like talking about the brain is that it really does impact a person's ability to engage in self-care and coping. And I think it's a really important foundation for people to get an understanding about. So in terms of the brain, what we're going to do is we're going to break up the brain as simple as it can be. There's so many different models, but we're going to try to keep it super duper simple by dividing the brain into two systems. We're going to have our logical system and then our survival brain system. So in terms of the logical brain, this is actually going to be made up of just the blue part in this photo. So in this photo, the blue part is known as your neocortex. Now you don't need to remember the names of this. You can keep it to just the logical and survival brain. But the logical brain and the neocortex are going to be actually the youngest part of your brain. So when research and studies out there talk about how the brain takes 25 to 30 years to develop, they're actually referring to this part of our brain. So this part of our brain takes the longest to develop, and it's actually responsible for things like logic and higher order thinking. So this includes our ability to think about consequences, our ability to plan and prioritize, our likes and dislikes, all of the things that kind of make a person consciously them are going to be stored in our logical brain. And as the logical brain kind of says, or what the name kind of says, it is the part of our brain where logic is engaged. So when we are in our logical brain, we have capacity to make choices, to make decisions, and to inform our choices with logic. Now, if we talk about the survival brain, we're going to look at the right-hand side. So the survival brain is going to be made up of your limbic system and your reptilian brain. So your limbic system is your second oldest part of your brain. This part of your brain is going to be your emotional brain and your stress response, so that fight or flight. And so this part of our brain is super important for so many different reasons, which we're going to dive into. And then, of course, you're going to have your reptilian brain. So this is the part of the brain that is the oldest. It's the part of the brain that develops first. And its only job at the end of the day is to keep you alive. And it doesn't really care how it does it. It just knows that it needs to keep you alive. So it is going to do things like regulate your breathing, your heart rate, hormone control, your temperature in your body, so many different things that help keep you going from day to day. So as the survival brain name kind of indicates, these two systems, again, are just designed to keep you alive. And this is going to be really important when we start talking about coping. So the survival brain, unlike the logical brain, isn't very conscious or voluntary. It's going to be a lot more involuntary. Because most of us, when we think about like breathing, for example, are not sitting there thinking, okay, breathe, okay, breathe. This is all happening unconsciously, but it's still happening even though we don't have to think about it. So with the brain, we're going to keep it to those two systems, but all I want you to do with this information is just keep it in the back of your mind as we start talking about self-care and coping. Okay, so what is self-care? I think many of us have heard of the word self-care one or many times in our lifetime, and many of us may have an idea of what self-care is, but sometimes our ideas may have been shaped by different messages given to us by the media, by friends, family, by society in general. And so as we kind of go through this conversation, I always like to have people in the back of their mind think about how many times do I actually engage in self-care and how many times would I like to engage in self-care. But in order to understand what self-care is, sometimes it's actually easier to do the opposite and think about what it's not. The brain has this funny way of working where sometimes it's actually easier to understand the negatives of something versus the positive first. So to kind of help work with our brain, we're going to kind of unpack what we know self-care isn't. So the first thing to know is that self-care is not indulgence. And what I mean by this is that self-care is not for the sake of just doing something because it gives us pleasure. While that can be a part of self-care, self-care is actually so much more than that. And is actually, as we go through this conversation, very important for our physical health, our mental health, our emotional well-being, and plays such an important role in the day-to-day functioning for many people. And so again, while it may bring pleasure, that's not its only purpose, as we'll kind of learn together. In addition to that, it's not selfish. A lot of people that I work with, when we talk about engaging in self-care, talk about this feeling of shame or guilt or this feeling of selfishness when they try to engage in self-care. I think it's a super fair feeling. I think it's, a feeling that a lot of people share. But when we're talking about self-care, it's really important to recognize that it's not meant to be selfish. I think we've all heard the cliche saying of when the mask on the airplane falls, we're meant to put ours on first before someone else. So the idea of helping ourselves before we can help other people. And self-care is meant to be a tool to allow us to be able to do that. And so by taking care of ourselves, it allows us to be able to show up as the best version of ourselves in other parts of our life. And by that definition, I would feel that if it allows me to show up in different spaces and be the best version of myself that I can be, then in the long run, it's actually helping other people. I feel a lot better when I'm not burnt out or stressed or tired and feel like I can be a better person to people in my life or show up better to my job. And so if this is a tool that allows me to do that, then I try to use that as a way to challenge the idea that it's not selfish, it's just a form of showing up for myself. Okay. In addition to that, it's not meant to be a one-time experience. So I know a lot of people, when we talk about the idea of self-care, talk about how hard it can sometimes feel to carve out time for themselves. And so it ends up becoming this like entire one special day of the month that they have. And while that can be a really important part of the routine, it's not the only way that we can engage in self-care. Self-care is meant to be something that is ongoing. Just like we take vitamins for physical health to prevent possible illnesses, self-care is kind of the same way for our mental health. It's meant to be preventative and something that we do ongoing. The next point is that it doesn't need to be time consuming. So just like I talked about earlier, I think, life is so busy, and something that we will talk about with window of tolerance is a lot of the messages that a lot of people are kind of pushed towards of this idea of always needing to be on the go. And with always needing to be on the go, with having so many different responsibilities that often people have, it can feel really overwhelming and hard to imagine when you get to actually create time for yourself. But the thing to really kind of keep in mind as we talk about this is that self-care can be super simple and it can take 10 seconds. An example of self-care could be in the morning before the chaos of your day starts. You have a sip of your hot coffee and enjoy that sip of hot coffee. Sorry. So when you're having that moment, you are actually engaging in self-care when you choose to notice that moment. So I am someone that the first sip of caffeine, when it hits my soul, I feel like a brand new person and that everything will be all right in the world because it feels all right in that moment. And by me taking that moment to acknowledge that, I get to feel good. And by noticing that I'm feeling good, I then am engaging in a form of self-care. And this might feel a little bit confusing, but it'll make sense in a little bit. But the idea is that self-care can take a small amount of time, it could take a whole day, not really any time limit that we have to be bound to. Additionally, it doesn't need to cost money. I think, unfortunately, consumerism has really impacted the way sometimes people view self-care. This idea that we need to have gym memberships or spa days or massages or buy new face products or face masks. And while these all can be a really great part of self-care, and I enjoy them, they're not the only types of self-care we can do. Again, it can be anything that makes us feel good. If we notice that we're really thirsty and have a sip of water and we notice that that makes us feel better, that can be a form of self-care. Most of us will buy the food that we have in our house, and if we take the time and enjoy that food, that could then be a form of self-care as well. It kind of gives you an idea of where we're going when we talk about what self-care is. So when we talk about self-care, based on all the things we know it's not, we can then kind of figure out that a definition of self-care is any act that is intentional, that is meant to take care of ourselves and our needs. So again, intentionality is going to be the really key piece here. Anything at the end of the day then can be a form of self-care as long as we are telling ourselves that it has a purpose. It's either making us feel good and it's taking care of ourselves, or it's meeting a need that we have. So a common example I often give when I talk about self-care is that I am someone who experiences many chronic illnesses. And the side effect of that is often having fatigue. So, when it comes to navigating my fatigue, I've had to learn over the years how to show up in terms of self care. So, one of my favorite forms of self care is when I have the chance and capacity and time. Sometimes I like to have a good nap or at least lie down for half an hour and just not do anything. Now, I feel a whole lot different when I name that I'm feeling tired, know that I have a few responsibilities after this break that I have that I still have to get through, and that I don't know if I'm going to have the energy to get through that or be the best version of myself if I don't take the time to just relax for half an hour. Versus if I ignore my feelings, don't even acknowledge that I'm tired, I just go on the couch and lay down. And then half an hour passes by and I'm like, oh shoot, like I shouldn't have laid down for half an hour. I feel so guilty. I have so much to do. Why did I do that? And now I just feel flustered. When you tell yourself, I'm noticing this feeling, this helps this feeling and will help me get through my day and make me feel good, and I get to show up as a better version. That is where that intentionality comes in and allows us to understand that we're doing this to take care of ourselves. So, with that said, of course, there are many benefits to self care, which I think most of us are aware of. But of course, sometimes it's always nice to review. So, when we engage in acts of self care, we're able to reduce or eliminate anxiety or depression. We're able to reduce stress. We can increase happiness, confidence, productivity. And then, of course, because self care is meant to help tackle life stress and tackle everything that can cause a lot of stress on our body, it does mean that it can help physically by reducing chances of heart disease, stroke, or cancer. Feels a little weird that I can't see people to check that everyone is following along okay. But yeah, in terms of self care, as we kind of continue to explore this, the one important thing I want us to keep in mind is that with intention, it does assume that we need to be more in our logical brain. So if we think back to our brain slide, self care really needs conscious and choices. We need to be conscious about what we're choosing, and we need to be pretty aware, which is a pretty good sign that we are going to be more in our logical brain when we are choosing self-care. Okay. So, of course, it's one thing. I'm just going to take a sip of water. It's one thing to talk about what self-care is, but it's a whole nother thing to kind of figure out, well, what do I do with this information and how do I actually create self-care? It can be really overwhelming to navigate this. And so it's important, as we talked about, to remember that anything can be self-care as long as there is intention. But there are some principles that can kind of help us figure out ways to create acts of self-care. So the first one is going to be boundaries. So boundaries are going to be really important with self-care because if we're talking about creating activities and intention and noticing our needs, we have to be able to actually say what our needs are. And boundaries are a really great way of helping you figure out what your needs are. I like to describe boundaries as like personal fences that everyone has that's going to tell people in your world and tell your world where you end and where someone else begins. With that in mind, when we have boundaries, they are meant to be flexible. They don't need to be written in permanent marker. And as you start to kind of explore self-care, you kind of get to choose and figure out and experiment what your limits are and what feels good and what doesn't feel good. And the more we experiment with boundaries and notice our body's inner signal of like, whoa, that kind of feels a little off. I don't really like that. The more we start to get in tune with our body and allow it to understand what its needs are and what its limits are, because we all have limits. Additionally, another principle is going to be moving from feeling more reactive to proactive. So what this means with self-care, because we're really going to notice this in coping, is that self-care is going to be more preventative, which means we want to be more proactive. The purpose of self-care when it comes to our mental well-being is to fill our cup before it becomes overflowed with stress. So everyone's going to have a meter of what they can handle. Um, a lot of times when I work with adults, they'll refer it to their bullshit meter, and I think that's a great way of describing it. But it's what is your meter for that day where you can handle what life is throwing at you? And this meter changes. It can change day to day. Sometimes it feels like it changes within an hour, depending on how crazy life is. And so the idea is we want to grow our meter with self-care. So self-care is doing small things with intention and creating those small moments so that you can grow that meter. A really common example I have with a lot of clients is going to be transitions. So, for example, when we are leaving work, what are we doing between work and home that maybe we could add a small act of self-care to help transition into the next part of our day? So for a lot of parents, like when they leave work and they go into their house and they know that the kids haven't defrosted the chicken and they have to like get on their kids' nerves about going on about homework and extracurriculars, they know that they're walking into a stressful environment. I always ask parents in that drive home, just check in with yourself, like notice, okay, how am I feeling? You know, for me, when I'm leaving work, I might feel tired sometimes. And so if I'm noticing I'm feeling tired, I might say, you know what, on my way home from work, I'm going to put a song that I really like and makes me feel really good. I'm going to listen to a podcast because that also makes me feel really good. And by doing that small act, my hope is that I've built just a little bit more in my meter to handle whatever stress is coming my way. And every time we do one small act throughout our day by checking in with ourselves, we hopefully then teach our brain to move away from being reactive and only dealing with things as they come and move towards being maybe more proactive. Okay. The next one is going to be just as we kind of talked about checking in with your body. So, your body and every person's body actually has this really cool system where it is designed to always move towards equilibrium. The body never wants to be off balance. And so, when we engage in self care, we allow our body to work together with us to make choices of how to meet that equilibrium. When we choose not to listen to the body, like we talked about with the survival brain, it's going to find equilibrium. It's going to create equilibrium, whether you want to be a part of that experience or not. And so when we engage in self-care, we actually allow ourselves to have a choice in what it looks like to move towards equilibrium. Okay. The next is going to be exploring what restores you. So sometimes the fun part about getting to explore self-care is getting to experiment and find out what makes me feel good and what actually like reduces my stress. I think during COVID, a lot of people got to really take the time to slow down and figure out what they like. I know so many of my friends took up baking and some of them loved it. Others were like, I will never do that again. I personally tried knitting, and knitting ended up causing more anxiety than I wanted to. But I did find out during that time that I loved embroidery, and that's kind of what it's all about, is taking the chance to try something out. And if it doesn't work, now you know that about yourself. But the idea is to give yourself that chance to try and actually take the opportunity to see if something does restore you and make you feel good. Because again, this is always going to vary from person to person. Like Nicole mentioned, she's not a fan of scary movies, but I love a good scary movie. And for whatever reason, it relaxes me. But I know that about myself because I've taken the time to kind of figure that out about myself. And of course, the most important kind of principle that can help you get started is going to be giving yourself permission. Permission is going to be the biggest gift you can actually give yourself because it allows you to recognize the importance of investing in yourself. And that by investing in yourself, you also allow yourself to show up as the best version of yourself to other people. It also allows you to kind of challenge any of those feelings of shame or guilt, um, or that selfishness feeling we talked about earlier, because it allows you to recognize that you have a need and that by doing this, you're meeting your need and you're giving yourself that permission to feel good and to just want what you want, which can be really freeing, but really hard sometimes to get to. And so with these principles, they're not meant as like hard, fast rules. These are what you need to do. They're meant to kind of help guide you as to how to navigate what actually feels good to our body and how we can meet these needs. Now, with that being said, of course, the next part is going to be exploring different kinds of self-care. So most people don't always realize, but there are so many different forms of self-care, and this is not even the entire list. These are the four that most people will kind of know how to approach, but there's spiritual. Oh, my list really came up there. There's spiritual self-care, which is about finding a deeper purpose and meaning. You also have like environmental self-care, which can be about taking care of the space you're in and making sure it motivates you rather than distracts you. There's financial self-care, intellectual self-care, like there's so many different types, and you can go down a rabbit hole. But these four are four that most people will be familiar with and kind of have some routine built around. So we're going to focus on these four for today. So the first self-care form is going to be physical self-care. It's going to be the basis for all others because it can really impact how we can engage in these other forms of self-care. And so physical self-care is going to be anything we do to take care of our body. So as you can see by the examples, it can look like eating well, drinking water, taking medication and vitamins, going for a walk, physical intimacy, like cuddling, hugging, anything like that, or even having a safe home. So some of these sometimes surprise people, like intimacy and having a safe home or medication, for example. But these are all things that we need to choose or have the privilege of choosing to be able to have. Not everyone actually has a safe home, and that's not always a choice, unfortunately. That not having a safe home means that their body is not going to feel regulated because there's always going to be something pulling us away from ourselves, usually that being safety. And when we don't feel safe, we're not going to feel like we have the ability to show up and make choices. So it is a privilege for a lot of people to actually have a safe home because having a safe home means they then get to use their brain capacity to make different choices in other parts of their life. Same thing with medication and vitamins. Not everyone, unfortunately, has coverage or the financial means to afford taking medications. And so when they don't get to take medications or when they don't remember to take medications, their physical body changes, which means some of the choices that they would have made had they had that aren't readily available to them. By doing these things, and again, there's so many different forms of physical self-care. It allows us to make different choices in other parts of our life. The other one is going to be mental and emotional. So mental is going to focus more on self-care towards our brain, and emotional is going to be self-care towards our feeling, because while they are both closely related, they do sometimes have different needs. So learning a new skill can be more sometimes for people seen as mental stimulation. It allows their brain to kind of learn something and engage in something that feels exciting for them, and maybe in turn it does impact their emotional being in that they feel proud or happy about what they're doing. Another example can be journaling, playing a game, watching a comfort show, having a good cry, or asking someone for help. But the idea is we want to take care of our mind's ability to understand and process information, or at least take care of our feelings and learn how to deal better with these feelings as they come up. Social self-care is going to be looking at how to build and maintain healthy interpersonal relationships. So as humans, we need connection. Connection is one of those basic needs that a lot of people have. And so by investing in our social self-care, we kind of build that part of our life up and meet an important need. So this can look like hanging out with friends, going out for coffee, calling someone, again, reaching out for support, but it can also look like setting boundaries. So understanding that, you know what, my social battery is tapped out. I cannot say yes to another activity, so I'm actually going to have to pass on this activity. But how about we reschedule for next week? Because we don't also need to take on all of the social expectations. We are allowed to have limits and recognize that our battery is drained and we actually need to recharge. And of course, the last one on this list is going to be professional or academic. Most people will have a big chunk of their day taken up by a job or schooling. So because it is a big part of many people's days, it's important to care for their needs in these settings. So for many people, this could like actually taking your lunch or taking a break. When we have vacation time, making sure to actually take that time off. It could be asking for help, whether it be from a teacher, a colleague, anything like that. Saying no, a really hard one, but also a form of self-care because again, it's establishing a boundary and recognizing my body actually can't take on anymore right now. We are already at the top. I actually have to say no to this one. Or of course, taking sick days can be a form of self-care. I know so many people who just try to work through sick days when your body, all it really needs in that moment is rest. And so again, as we look at this list, just really noticing how these are really simple ideas, but in practice, they can be really hard sometimes because in order to do them, we have to recognize that it either A, makes us feel good, or B, is meeting a need that we have. Okay. So that now brings us to the other side of our conversation, which is what is coping? So most people, again, will have heard of what coping is, but sometimes it's nice to kind of go back to the basics. So coping can be conscious or unconscious actions taken to reduce an experience. So because it is conscious or unconscious, that does mean we're more likely to be working with our survival brain, especially if we've had to cope for long periods of time. Usually coping skills are going to come up when something is unexpected. So this is going to be more of a reactive skill rather than a proactive skill. So usually we'll notice coping more when life kind of throws us those curveballs and we kind of just need to get through that moment so that we can get on with our day. Generally, coping is meant to be long or short-term, sorry. As again, we talked about, it's meant to just keep our head above water. So we're trying to control what we can control. Does this always mean that it gets to be short-term? No. However, the idea is that we want to move away from coping long-term and instead change it to short-term and bring in self-care as a way to proactively kind of keep our meter bigger. But with coping, the assumption is our meter is quite small. And so we're just doing these small things to kind of get through whatever is going on. Additionally, an important thing to know about coping is that we can develop coping patterns, and this is when our brain learns that this is a strategy that works. People often default to skills that they practice regularly because the brain wants accessibility. It likes easy, no matter what. Even a teenage brain will like easy, but so will an adult brain. If you think of a big white snowy field and you see one path that's been walked on over and over again, and then you see just blank snow that you need to create a path, the brain wants to choose the path that everyone has already walked on because it's a lot more convenient. And this is where coping patterns start to come in. But when we want to change a coping pattern, that means we have to start creating a habit, which can feel really hard. Um, and so this is why sometimes people talk about, well, I don't know why I deal with it this way. And I don't like that I deal with this way, but I don't know how else to deal with it any other way. And it's because our brain wants to default to something it already knows works. If our brain's only job is to keep it alive, it doesn't care how it keeps it alive. And it's not really checking in with logic because logic is not a part of the survival brain. And it's going to want to go to what it already knows. And this is why self-care can be really important because the more we practice a skill in self-care, the more we start to create a new path for our brain so that it actually feels like it has a choice. So a fork in the road rather than just, no, this is the only way we can do something. And of course, when we talk about coping, something that's really important for me, especially in a trauma-informed lens, is to challenge stigmas that come around coping. So a self-stigma is going to refer to any negative attitudes someone may have, including internalized shame that people have about their own experience. When we create shame about an experience, we actually reduce our capacity to recognize what we had to go through in that moment and what we can grow through. So by reducing stigmas and shame, steps that we can take can be to eliminate the words good, positive, or bad or negative coping skills. I always just tell people coping is coping. You're doing what you can to get through a moment. Sometimes we have a choice, and as we're going to see in a little bit, sometimes we don't. But as long as you're here and you haven't caused detrimental harm to other people, I, for one, am usually just grateful my clients are here. And if we want to change something, we always have capacity to grow. But when we bring shame into that experience, it makes it a lot harder to recognize where we can grow. So, of course, when we're trying to challenge stigmas, it's important to understand that we're all just trying to do our best. So, with coping, there's also different types of coping skills. Coping is pretty complex in so many different ways, and your body is going to naturally know what feels good. And so as you look at this list, you might have certain things that you're like, oh yeah, like I do that all the time. And you might have things where you're like, that's not really my go-to, and that's okay. There's no need, unlike self-care, where we encourage you to kind of meet different forms of self-care. With coping, we don't need necessarily to meet all of these different types of coping skills. But diversifying can help our brain recognize that it has capacity for choice. The other nice thing about coping skills is it can be linked to self-care. And so for many, coping becomes a part of their self-care routine when they feel they have capacity to help retrain their brains to make those different pathways like we talked about. To help build that accessibility. So if journaling, for example, is a form of self-care that we like to do, it might also then show up in our coping skills, which would meet the needs of emotional awareness, maybe self-soothing and grounding. So when you look at these different types, we do have emotional awareness, which is going to be anything that you do to kind of bring awareness to how you're feeling in that moment and possibly express that feeling. Distraction, I think, is a go-to for many people, and I think a lot of people give it a hard time, but it has an important role. I would never tell someone who's going through a panic attack to be emotionally aware of that panic attack and really sit with it. I think that would be the worst thing you could do for someone with a panic attack. Usually, when we're working with panic attacks, we actually want to distract ourselves first so that we can reduce the intensity of the problem and then come back to it. So, distraction is really important because sometimes we can't sit with the intensity of something. So, we need to bring that intensity down. And then, once it's down, maybe then we can revisit it. Grounding is also going to be really great. So this is anything we do to kind of center ourselves and stay present. This can include meditation, yoga, five senses, but it can also be music if music is really grounding. It's so hard to get stuck in your brain while you're singing your favorite song. So that can be a very grounding experience. Same thing with like smells or drinking anything. Cold is a really great example of grounding, especially in our winters with -40. So many times I will walk out the door and forget completely what I was thinking about because the only thing my body can now focus on is how cold it is. Self-soothing is going to be anything that helps bring comfort to ourselves. And then, of course, cognitive challenge is going to be anything we do to kind of help challenge any negative thoughts that are coming up. Crisis planning is not something everyone may have experience in, and it's not always necessary. But it is an important part of coping for times when it feels difficult to maybe stay safe and our other coping skills aren't enough. Okay. So now that we've talked a little bit about the difference between self-care and coping, we're going to kind of revisit what those differences are. So how do we know when we need to choose self-care or coping? So self-care, like we talked about, is meant to be more preventative. It's meant to attend to our needs in the moment when we notice them. It's meant to decrease stress and distress and burnout. Again, it's meant to be more long-term and hopefully in time decrease our need for coping skills in the future. I always like to frame, as you'll see in the picture below, that self-care is kind of like going to the dentist. When we go to the dentist, we don't wait until the next time we go to the dentist to take care of our teeth. We are always doing small acts to kind of help maintain our teeth health until the next time we go to the dentist, whether that's brushing our teeth or flossing. All of these things help oh, Jesus. All of these things are preventative actions we keep doing so that the next time we go to the dentist, hopefully we don't have a lot of cavities to fill in. Coping is going to be the opposite. So coping is meant to be more reactive, used to get through a lot of stress, used to buy time and energy, meant to be short term, and it's not always going to be logical because again, our logical brain is not a part of that experience all the time. It's usually our survival brain that kind of takes over. So I always like to frame coping as like firefighters. So we call firefighters when there's an emergency. They have a very important job. And one thing I like to kind of help clients recognize when we're talking about challenging the inner thoughts we have is when a firefighter comes, we don't shame the firefighter when our house is in a disarray. We're not like, wow, I feel like you could have handled that fire a little bit better and maybe not destroyed my beautiful couch. We're usually thankful that they came to the scene, did what they could, and we'll deal with the mess, but they did their job and we do not leave them responsible for anything that was an after effect. Coping is the same way. Your brain is just trying to get through a situation, and rather than shaming how it got through that situation, it would probably feel better for our brain to recognize, you know what? I don't love how I handled that, but I'm glad I got through that situation. And I think next time I would make this type of a choice. So I am going to show you a couple of questions here, and I'm going to give you a minute to answer these questions, and then we're going to talk quickly about them. So take a second here, and I might not give you a full minute just because of time. But just take a second here to I'm going to give you 10 more seconds. I really want to make sure we have enough time here. Okay. So, how many of us actually got to any of the answers of that question? And of course, this is going to be an internal question. But the purpose of those questions is they were not meant to be solved. I tried to find the hardest riddles I could, but the purpose of these questions was to introduce how stress impacts us and why window tolerance is important. Stress changes our ability to make choices. I've had so many different people react differently to that exercise. Some people said they stopped reading halfway through because they knew they wouldn't beat the time. Other people said they were so frantic and just were trying so hard to figure out the answer. And other people just shut down. They just decided they weren't even going to try because as soon as they heard the time limit and saw that many words on the screen, they were like, nope, not for me. But this is about window of tolerance. So window of tolerance is all about how our body regulates itself. So we have a green, a red, and a blue zone. A green zone is going to be our logical brain, where we're going to be able to feel present and grounded and make choices. And on this chart, you're going to notice, if I can move my arrow. Okay, here we go. You're going to notice the squiggly line. The squiggly line is just talking about the normal parts of life in experiencing stress. I think I'd be more worried if people said they never experienced stress. But stress is bound to happen. And so that normal squiggly line talks about how every time we experience stress, it's natural to move into our red zone, which is going to be that fight or flight. And this is because every one time we feel worried, anxious, scared, angry, stressed, our body releases adrenaline, and that adrenaline stays in your body for half an hour. So you have half an hour of adrenaline kind of pumping through, which means naturally we're going to be in an elevated state. Now, if we're chronically stressed, chronically anxious, chronically angry, we're going to have hours of adrenaline pumping through our body, which means we're more likely to be staying in our red zone. And when we're in our red zone, and the longer we're in our red zone, the more likely we're going to be in our survival brain, which means we've now reduced our body's capacity to make choices, and our body just wants to get through it. So your red zone is going to be more likely where coping shows up. But our body is not meant to stay in the red zone. It's literally going to kill you if you have hours and hours of adrenaline pumping through your body. The body is not meant to move really fast paced. And I know society pushes this idea that we need to be fast paced, but that is not biologically how the body can handle things. And so if the body feels like it has been in the red zone for too much, and it feels like it cannot go down to that logical green zone because self-care just doesn't feel possible at this point, our body is then going to make a choice to push us into our blue zone. And your blue zone is your shutdown zone. So anytime I work with clients, I always like to frame it as, think of your body as a cell phone battery. If your green zone is your 100 to 50%, and your red zone is your 50 to 20%. If you were to use your phone at 20%, just like it was at 100%, and you don't have a charger nearby, your phone is going to die, which means we need to charge it. And your phone, when it has no battery, won't even let you turn it on until it has a certain amount of battery in it. And that's kind of like your blue zone. Your body is telling you, you need to calm down and we need to take a break. If we know that we can't do that with phones, I often challenge clients, then why do we do that with our bodies? When we're in our red zone, why are we pushing our body like it's 100%? And this is where, again, self-care and coping is really important, and why when we talk about this idea of surviving and thriving. When we understand our window of tolerance, it actually impacts our understanding of what our body has capacity to choose. So, knowing our window of tolerance allows us to build self compassion. If we are thriving or in our green zone, it means we know that we have capacity and logic. So we get to choose better options for ourselves. It means we have the luxury of being like, you know what? Today I'm feeling tired, so I'm going to take a rest for half an hour. Or, oh my goodness, I'm feeling really frazzled, so I need to take a deep breath and maybe have a cup of coffee right now to just have a moment to myself. But when we are surviving, which is going to be those red or blue zones, that means we're relying on our survival brain, which means we're ultimately relying on automatic responses. And this is going to mean that our choice is limited, or it feels like we don't really have a choice in how we're showing up. It's also going to mean logic is not always attached. So we might sometimes be like, that was a really questionable choice. Don't know why I did that. But if we're not in our green zone or we're not thriving, we don't always have the luxury of having logic attached to our choices because we're in our survival brain. It also means that our default mode is going to be more negative. Our survival brain's only job is to keep you alive. And when we are in our survival brain, it is not looking for how beautiful the sunset is. It is looking for everything it thinks is going to cause danger for you. And this is why when we are in our red and blue zones, it feels really heavy. But it's also why self-care is really important, because it's going to challenge that negative default mode that sometimes our brain wants to be in. Well, that is a very quick and a very fast rundown about self-care and coping, which does mean we're now at our question period. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Brittany. That was a
Yeah.
great presentation. Oh my gosh, so informative. For those of you that aren't able to stay for the Q&A, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us. I hope you'll come back again sometime and have a good night.
Thank you.